The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty roads leading to Pusan as Lieutenant Colonel John Miller wiped the sweat and grime from his brow. Behind him, the distant rumble of North Korean tanks echoed like thunder across the Korean peninsula. It was August 4th, 1950, and the remnants of the United Nations forces were being pushed to what many believed would be their final resting place. Miller's weathered hands gripped his field glasses as he surveyed the defensive line that would soon become legendary. The Pusan perimeter stretched like a desperate arc around the southeastern tip of South Korea, following the Naktong River's meandering path northward before curving back toward the port city of Pusan. This 140-mile defensive rectangle represented more than just terrain. It was the last hope for democracy on the Korean peninsula. "Sir, General Walker's orders just came through," Sergeant Martinez called out, his voice hoarse from days of retreat. The young soldier's uniform was torn and stained, a testament to the grueling withdrawal that had brought them to this moment. Lieutenant General Walton Harris Walker, commander of the United States 8th Army, had issued what would become one of the most famous orders in military history: stand or die. The North Korean People's Army had swept down from the 38th parallel with devastating efficiency, their 98,000 troops seemingly unstoppable. Seoul had fallen within days, and now the communist forces pressed southward with relentless determination. Every major city between the border and Pusan bore the scars of their advance. Suwon, Daejeon, and countless smaller towns now lay under North Korean control. Miller's mind raced as he considered their situation. The United Nations command forces, numbering approximately 140,000 troops, were a patchwork of American, South Korean, British, Turkish, and other allied units. Many were green recruits who had never seen combat, thrown into the crucible of war with barely adequate training. Others were battle-hardened veterans of World War II, their faces bearing the grim determination of men who had seen empires rise and fall. According to historical accounts from the Korean War Legacy Foundation, UN commanders sent every available man to the front lines, with even non-combat engineers who would normally be building bridges and manning radios ending up in trenches with guns in their hands. The desperation of their situation demanded such extreme measures. The strategic importance of Pusan could not be overstated. This bustling port city served as the primary lifeline connecting the United Nations forces to the outside world. Through its harbors flowed the endless stream of supplies, reinforcements, and equipment that kept the Allied forces fighting. Should Pusan fall, the United Nations command would face the impossible choice between a catastrophic evacuation reminiscent of Dunkirk or complete annihilation on foreign soil. As Miller surveyed the defensive preparations, he could see American soldiers from the 24th and 25th Infantry Divisions digging foxholes alongside South Korean troops whose determination burned bright despite their limited equipment. The 1st Cavalry Division was positioning itself along key sectors of the line, while the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade prepared for the inevitable counterattacks that General Walker was already planning. The terrain itself offered both advantages and challenges. The Naktong River provided a natural barrier along much of the northern perimeter, its waters running swift and deep in many places. However, the river was not impassable, and intelligence reports indicated that North Korean engineers were already probing for suitable crossing points. To the west, the mountainous terrain provided defensive positions, but also concealed enemy movements and made coordination between units extremely difficult. Colonel Miller knew that time was their most precious commodity. Every hour they could hold the perimeter was another hour for reinforcements to arrive from Japan and the United States. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the United Nations forces from his headquarters in Tokyo, was already planning a Bo-LD counterstroke that would require the Pusan perimeter to hold firm for weeks, possibly months. The sound of incoming artillery interrupted Miller's thoughts, and he instinctively ducked as shells whistled overhead to explode harmlessly in the distance. The North Koreans were probing the defenses, testing for weak points in the hastily constructed line. Soon, Miller knew, those probing attacks would give way to full-scale assaults designed to crack the perimeter once and for all. As darkness began to fall over the battlefield, Miller gathered his officers for a final briefing. The faces around him reflected the gravity of their situation. Young lieutenants barely out of West Point stood alongside grizzled sergeants who had fought their way across the Pacific. Tomorrow would test them all in ways they could scarcely imagine, but tonight they would prepare for the battle that would determine the fate of South Korea, and potentially the entire Cold War struggle between East and West. Dawn broke on August 7, 1950, with the thunderous roar of North Korean artillery pounding the western sectors of the Pusan perimeter. Captain James Richardson of the 25th Infantry Division pressed himself against the muddy walls of his command bunker as shells screamed overhead, their explosions sending fountains of earth skyward along the Naktong River line. "Here they come!" shouted Private First Class Tommy Chen, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of battle. Through the smoke and dust, the distinctive silhouettes of North Korean T-34 tanks emerged like mechanical beasts, their treads churning up clouds of debris as they rumbled toward the American positions. Behind them came waves of infantry, their burp guns chattering as they advanced across the open ground. The first battle of Naktong Bulge had begun in earnest, and Richardson knew that this was the moment General Walker had prepared them for. The North Korean 4th Division, supported by elements of the 3rd Division, was making its primary assault against Task Force Keene's positions around Chinju and Masan. Major General William Butler Keene had positioned his composite force strategically, combining units from the 25th Infantry Division, the 5th Regimental Combat Team, and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade into a flexible defensive network. Richardson's radio crackled with urgent reports from observation posts scattered throughout the sector. "Charlie Company taking heavy fire from Grid 274, came one transmission, followed immediately by another. "Enemy armor spotted crossing the river at Ford Site Baker." The North Koreans were executing a coordinated assault designed to punch through the perimeter at its weakest point. The American response was swift and deadly. Artillery batteries that had been carefully pre-registered on likely enemy approach routes opened fire with devastating effect. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion, supported by naval gunfire from destroyers offshore, turned the riverbank into a killing field. However, the North Korean advance continued with grim determination, their political officers driving reluctant soldiers forward at gunpoint. Marine Sergeant Bill Morrison of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade watched through his rifle scope as enemy infantry attempted to establish a bridgehead across the Naktong. The Marines had earned their reputation in the Pacific campaigns of World War II, and they brought that hard-won expertise to the Korean Peninsula. Morrison's squad occupied a hillside position that commanded excellent fields of fire across the river valley below. "Range 400 yards, Morrison called to his automatic weapons team. "Fire when ready." The Marine Browning automatic rifles opened up in disciplined bursts, their heavy bullets cutting through the North Korean ranks like a scythe through wheat. However, for every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place, and gradually the communist forces began to establish footholds on the southern bank. The battle raged throughout the morning hours, with positions changing hands multiple times as both sides fed reinforcements into the growing conflagration. American fighter bombers roared overhead, their rockets and napalm strikes creating towering pillars of flame that marked the forward edge of the North Korean advance. The F-80 Shooting Stars and F-4U Corsairs of the United States Air Force and Navy provided crucial close air support, but they could not be everywhere at once. By midday, disturbing reports began filtering back to Lieutenant General Walker's headquarters. North Korean forces had succeeded in establishing several bridgeheads across the Naktong River, and their follow-on forces were exploiting these gaps with characteristic speed and aggression. The 24th Infantry Regiment found itself under particularly intense pressure as enemy tanks broke through their lines near Yongsan. Walker's response demonstrated the tactical flexibility that would make him legendary among military historians. Rather than attempting to hold every inch of ground, he implemented a strategy of elastic defense, allowing certain positions to bend under pressure while maintaining the integrity of the overall perimeter. Reserve units were rushed to threatened sectors, creating a constantly shifting pattern of reinforcement and counterattack. The human cost of this strategy became apparent as casualty reports streamed into field hospitals throughout the perimeter. Medics worked frantically to stabilize wounded soldiers before evacuating them to medical facilities in Pusan, while chaplains moved among the wounded offering what comfort they could. The 8th Army's Medical Corps faced challenges unlike anything they had encountered in previous conflicts. The sheer volume of casualties, combined with the intense summer heat and limited medical supplies, pushed their capabilities to the breaking point. As evening approached, the intensity of combat began to subside temporarily, but both sides used the lull to prepare for renewed fighting. North Korean engineers worked feverishly to improve their river crossing sites, while American artillery forward observers adjusted their targeting data based on the day's observations. The night would bring its own terrors, with infiltration attempts and surprise attacks testing the alertness and resolve of defenders throughout the perimeter. Colonel Miller found himself wondering if they could sustain this level of combat intensity for the weeks or months that might be required. The North Koreans showed no signs of abandoning their offensive, and intelligence reports suggested that additional enemy divisions were moving south to join the assault on the perimeter. The race against time had become even more desperate, with every day bringing new challenges that tested the limits of human endurance and military capability. The pre-dawn darkness of August 12, 1950, was shattered by the scream of incoming rockets as North Korean Katyusha launchers unleashed their deadly salvos across the Naktong River. Corporal Eddie Washington of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, hugged the bottom of his foxhole as the ground trembled beneath him. The communist forces had intensified their attacks, recognizing that time was running short before United Nations reinforcements could tip the balance decisively. "Movement to the front!" hollered Staff Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, his Irish accent thick with tension as he peered through the tactical periscope mounted in his bunker. Through the early morning haze, shadowy figures were splashing across the river at what intelligence had designated as Crossing Point Charlie. The North Korean 13th Division had chosen this sector for their main effort, hoping to break through the tired American defenders who had been fighting without significant rest for over a week. Washington checked his M1 Garand rifle for the 100th time that morning, ensuring that the 8-round clip was fully loaded and that his bayonet was properly secured. Around him, his squad mates went through similar rituals, their movements automatic after days of continuous combat. Private Martinez clutched his Browning automatic rifle with white knuckles, while Corporal Johnson adjusted the bipod on his light machine gun to cover the most likely enemy approach routes. The sound of enemy boots splashing through the shallow sections of the Naktong grew closer, accompanied by the harsh whispers of North Korean squad leaders coordinating their advance. Washington could make out individual voices now, speaking in rapid Korean as they moved through the pre-dawn gloom. His heart pounded against his ribs as he waited for O'Malley's command to open fire. "Steady, boys," O'Malley whispered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived the beaches of Normandy and the hedgerows of France. "Let them get close enough to see the whites of their eyes before we give them hell." The sergeant's World War II experience proved invaluable in these desperate circumstances, as younger soldiers looked to veterans like him for guidance and inspiration. The first North Korean soldier to emerge from the river reeds was barely 20 years old, his uniform soaked and his rifle held high above his head to keep it dry. Behind him came dozens more, their movements coordinated despite the difficult conditions. Some carried satchel charges designed to destroy American bunkers, while others hauled light mortars and ammunition across the treacherous river crossing. When O'Malley finally gave the signal to fire, the American positions erupted in a coordinated symphony of destruction. Rifle fire cracked like whips across the water, while machine gun tracers drew deadly arcs through the darkness. The North Korean advance staggered under the initial volley, but their political officers drove them forward with a combination of inspiration and intimidation that kept the assault moving despite horrific casualties. Private Martinez's bar hammered out its distinctive rhythm, sending 20-round magazines downrange in controlled bursts that cut through enemy ranks with devastating effect. However, the North Koreans had learned from their previous attempts, and this time they came prepared with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. Mortar shells began falling among the American positions, forcing defenders to keep their heads down, just as enemy infantry closed the distance. The battle quickly devolved into close-quarters combat as North Korean soldiers reached the American trenches and bunkers. Washington found himself locked in hand-to-hand combat with a communist soldier whose determination matched his own desperate desire to survive. Bayonets clashed and rifle butts swung as men fought with primal savagery in the confined spaces of the defensive positions. Throughout the perimeter, similar scenes played out as the North Korean assault reached its climax. The 1st Marine Provisional Brigade faced simultaneous attacks along their assigned sector, with enemy infiltrators using the mountainous terrain to approach undetected until they were within grenade range. Marine Corps training and esprit de corps proved crucial as small unit leaders maintained cohesion despite the chaos surrounding them. Major Robert Sims of the 105th Field Artillery Battalion coordinated defensive fires from his command post, calling down barrages that walked the line between enemy positions and friendly forces. The margin for error was measured in yards rather than miles, requiring precise calculations and split-second timing to avoid friendly fire incidents. Radio communications crackled with urgent fire missions as forward observers called for support against advancing enemy formations. Fire mission, grid 327489, enemy infantry in the open, fire for effect, came one transmission, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of outgoing artillery rounds. The 105mm howitzers of the artillery battalions worked around the clock, their crews operating in sweltering heat, while enemy counter-battery fire sought to silence their guns. By mid-morning, several American positions had been overrun, forcing General Walker to commit his precious reserves to contain the breakthrough. The situation had become so desperate that cooks, clerks, and other support personnel found themselves manning defensive positions alongside combat infantry. Every able-bodied soldier, regardless of their primary military occupation, became part of the thin line holding back the communist tide. The psychological pressure on the defenders was immense, exacerbated by the constant din of battle and the summer heat that made even simple movements exhausting. Water became as precious as ammunition, while medical supplies dwindled to critical levels despite continuous resupply efforts from Pusan. The wounded often had to wait hours for evacuation, their cries adding to the horror of an already hellish situation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, both sides recognized that this battle would determine the immediate fate of the Pusan perimeter. The North Koreans had committed their strategic reserves to this assault, gambling everything on achieving a decisive breakthrough that would collapse the entire United Nations defensive line. For the Americans and their allies, retreat was no longer an option. Behind them lay only the sea. August 15, 1950 dawned with an eerie quiet that fooled no one along the Pusan perimeter. Captain Robert Hayes of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment knew from experience that such silences often preceded the most devastating enemy assaults. As he moved through his company's positions in the pre-dawn darkness, checking on his men and inspecting their defensive preparations, Hayes could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Captain, we've got movement across the river," whispered Lieutenant David Park, a Korean-American officer whose language skills had proven invaluable during the retreat south. Through his binoculars, Park had spotted North Korean reconnaissance teams probing the American lines, searching for weak points in the defensive network that had held firm for nearly 2 weeks of continuous assault. Hayes nodded grimly as he studied the intelligence reports that had arrived during the night. North Korean General Kim Chek had massed virtually every available unit for what intelligence analysts believed would be the final, decisive assault on the perimeter. The Communist forces had been reinforced by fresh divisions from North Korea, while their artillery had been significantly strengthened by Soviet-supplied equipment that had arrived via the Trans-Siberian Railway. The American positions reflected the desperate improvisation that characterized the entire Pusan perimeter defense. Sandbags filled with Korean soil formed the backbone of the defensive line, while discarded ammunition boxes and equipment cases provided additional protection. Barbed wire stretched in multiple belts across likely enemy approach routes, and carefully sited mines created killing fields that channeled attacking forces into predetermined engagement areas. Private First Class Michael Kowalski of Chicago cleaned his rifle methodically as he waited in his foxhole, trying not to think about the letter from home that had arrived the previous day. His younger brother had just started high school, and his parents were worried about the news reports filtering back from Korea. Kowalski had tried to write reassuring letters, but it became increasingly difficult to find positive things to say about their situation. The morning's first artillery barrage began precisely at 0600 hours, with North Korean guns firing from concealed positions across the Naktong River. The bombardment was more intense than anything the defenders had previously experienced, with high-explosive shells interspersed with white phosphorus rounds designed to create smoke screens for advancing infantry. American counter-battery fire responded immediately, but the enemy guns had been well camouflaged and proved difficult to locate and destroy. Sergeant First Class William Tank Johnson earned his nickname from his imposing physical presence and his ability to remain calm under the most intense enemy fire. As squad leader for 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, Johnson had already earned the respect of his men through his tactical competence and personal courage. Today would test both qualities to their absolute limits as the North Korean assault reached unprecedented levels of intensity. "They're coming across in force," shouted Corporal Anderson from his observation post, his voice barely audible above the thunderous artillery exchange. Through the smoke and dust, hundreds of North Korean soldiers were wading across the Naktong River at multiple points, their assault rifles held high above their heads as they navigated the treacherous current. Behind them, enemy engineers had thrown temporary bridges across the narrower sections of the river, allowing heavier equipment to follow the infantry assault. The American response demonstrated the hard-won tactical expertise that had developed during weeks of continuous combat. Pre-registered artillery fire began falling on the river-crossing sites within minutes, turning the water red with blood as high-explosive shells detonated among the packed enemy formations. However, the North Koreans pressed forward with fanatical determination, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for establishing footholds on the southern bank. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez of the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade coordinated the defense of Hill 255, a critical terrain feature that commanded excellent observation and fields of fire across the Naktong Valley. Rodriguez had fought through the Pacific campaigns of World War II, including Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, but the intensity of combat in Korea matched anything he had previously experienced. "Concentrate your fire on the enemy machine gun positions," Rodriguez bellowed to his Marines as North Korean heavy weapons began establishing supporting fires for their advancing infantry. The sound of incoming bullets filled the air with a deadly symphony, punctuated by the deeper roar of enemy mortars and the shriek of incoming artillery shells. The battle for Hill 255 became a microcosm of the larger struggle for the Pusan perimeter, with small unit actions determining the outcome of strategic objectives. Marine rifle squads occupied fighting positions that had been carved into the rocky hillside, their interlocking fields of fire creating a lethal web that trapped advancing enemy soldiers in carefully prepared killing zones. Private Rodriguez called for close air support as enemy infantry reached the base of Hill 255, but cloud cover and the proximity of friendly forces made accurate bombing runs extremely difficult. Navy Corsair pilots flying from carriers offshore pushed their aircraft to the limits of performance as they attempted to provide support without hitting their own troops, often diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver napalm and rockets against enemy positions. By noon, several American positions had been overrun despite the heroic resistance of their defenders. North Korean infiltration teams had penetrated deep into the perimeter, creating confusion and panic as they attacked supply lines and command posts behind the main line of resistance. Military police units found themselves fighting as infantry while trying to maintain security in the rear areas. The human cost of the battle became evident in the field hospitals scattered throughout the Pusan area, where medical personnel worked frantically to save lives under primitive conditions. Nurses and doctors who had trained for peacetime medicine found themselves performing battlefield surgery with limited supplies and equipment, their skills tested by wounds unlike anything described in medical textbooks. As evening approached, both sides recognized that the battle had reached a critical juncture that would determine the immediate future of the Korean conflict. The North Koreans had committed their final reserves to achieving a breakthrough, while the United Nations forces had exhausted their ability to absorb further attacks without decisive reinforcement or a fundamental change in the tactical situation. September 1st, 1950, brought unexpected developments that would fundamentally alter the character of the battle for the Pusan perimeter. Major General Edward Almond's X-Corps had been secretly assembling at ports in Japan, preparing for what would become one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history. However, the defenders along the Nakhtong River remained unaware of these preparations as they continued their desperate struggle against overwhelming enemy forces. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell of the 8th Army Staff had spent the previous night coordinating the evacuation of wounded personnel from forward medical stations that had come under direct enemy fire. The North Korean breakthrough at several points along the perimeter had brought Communist forces within artillery range of previously secure rear areas, forcing the relocation of supply dumps, headquarters units, and medical facilities. "Sir, we've got enemy armor approaching Checkpoint 7. Reported Captain Susan Davis, one of the few female officers serving with the 8th Army Medical Corps. Through her field glasses, Davis could observe North Korean T-34 tanks grinding their way through the rubble of what had once been a thriving Korean village. The tanks were supported by infantry riding on their external surfaces, a tactic that maximized mobility while minimizing exposure to American artillery fire. The tank threat represented a new dimension to the battle for the perimeter, as North Korean armored units had previously been held back for the anticipated breakthrough operation. Now, with Communist forces achieving limited penetrations at several points, enemy commanders were committing their mechanized reserves in an attempt to exploit these tactical successes before American defenses could reorganize. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson of the 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry Regiment, prepared his recoilless rifle team for action as the enemy tanks approached their sector. The 75mm recoilless rifle represented one of the few anti-tank weapons available to American infantry units, but its effectiveness required careful positioning and precise timing to achieve hits on moving targets. "Wait until they close to within 300 yards, Thompson instructed his gunner, Corporal James Kim, whose Korean heritage had made him invaluable as both a soldier and an interpreter. Kim had joined the Army to escape poverty in California's agricultural valleys, never imagining that his family's ancestral homeland would become a battlefield where his life hung in the balance. The North Korean tank column advanced with characteristic aggressiveness, their crews confident that American infantry units lacked adequate anti-tank capabilities. However, the defenders had learned hard lessons during weeks of combat, and improvised anti-tank tactics had evolved through bitter experience. Bazooka's teams positioned themselves in buildings along the enemy's likely route of advance, while engineers prepared demolition charges to destroy bridges and create obstacles. Thompson's recoilless rifle spoke with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley, sending its high-explosive anti-tank round screaming toward the lead T-34. The projectile struck the tank's side armor with devastating effect, penetrating the steel plating and igniting the ammunition stored inside the fighting compartment. The tank erupted in a towering pillar of flame and smoke, its turret blown completely off the hull by the secondary explosion. The destruction of the lead tank temporarily halted the enemy advance, but North Korean infantry immediately began maneuvering to eliminate the anti-tank position that threatened their armored support. Communist soldiers armed with burp guns and grenades worked their way through the rubble-filled streets, using destroyed buildings as cover while they closed the distance to Thompson's position. "Fall back to secondary positions," Thompson ordered as enemy fire began impacting around his recoilless rifle. The withdrawal was conducted under intense pressure, with American soldiers providing covering fire for each other while bounding back through prepared defensive positions. This tactical movement had been practiced repeatedly during the lull periods between enemy assaults, and the training proved its worth under combat conditions. Private Danny Sullivan of the Medical Corps found himself treating wounded soldiers in a bombed-out schoolhouse that had been converted into a forward aid station. The 19-year-old medic had volunteered for medical training because he thought it would keep him away from direct combat, but the fluid nature of the fighting around the Pusan perimeter had brought the war directly to his doorstep. "Medic! We need help over here!" came the familiar cry that had haunted Sullivan's dreams for weeks. A wounded infantry sergeant had been carried into the aid station with shrapnel wounds to his chest and arms, his uniform soaked with blood that continued to flow despite the field dressings that had been hastily applied. Sullivan worked quickly to establish an intravenous line while assessing the extent of the sergeant's injuries. The sound of incoming mortar fire interrupted Sullivan's medical procedures as North Korean indirect fire began falling around the aid station. The enemy had observed the constant flow of wounded soldiers and ambulances, correctly identifying the location as a high-value target. However, the laws of war prohibited deliberate attacks on medical facilities, a restriction that North Korean forces seemed increasingly willing to ignore as the battle intensified. "We need to evacuate this position immediately," declared Captain Davis as she surveyed the tactical situation from her command post. The aid station's location had become untenable as enemy forces closed in from multiple directions, threatening to overrun the medical facility and capture or kill the wounded soldiers who could not be moved quickly. The evacuation of wounded personnel under enemy fire represented one of the most challenging aspects of combat medicine, requiring split-second decisions about which patients could survive the rigors of emergency transportation. Sullivan and his fellow medics worked frantically to stabilize the most seriously wounded while preparing others for immediate movement to rear-area hospitals. Air support arrived in the form of Marine Corps Corsairs flying close air support missions that brought them within small arms range of enemy positions. The pilots pushed their aircraft to the limits of safety as they delivered napalm strikes and rocket attacks against North Korean forces threatening the medical evacuation. However, the proximity of friendly forces made accurate bombing extremely difficult, requiring exceptional skill and courage from the aviators. As darkness fell across the battlefield, both sides began preparing for what many sensed would be the final phase of the battle for the Pusan perimeter. Intelligence reports suggested that North Korean forces were massing for one last, desperate assault, designed to achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them for over a month of continuous fighting. The outcome of this final effort would determine whether the United Nations forces could maintain their foothold on the Korean peninsula or face evacuation under the most adverse conditions imaginable. September 10, 1950, witnessed the most ferocious fighting yet seen along the Pusan perimeter as North Korean forces launched what intelligence analysts recognized as their final all-or-nothing assault. Colonel Frank Morrison of the 1st Cavalry Division watched through his field glasses as enemy artillery preparation reached unprecedented levels of intensity, with shells falling at rates that approached 1 round per second across critical sectors of the defensive line. The North Korean plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. General Kim Chek had concentrated virtually every available artillery piece, tank, and infantry unit for a coordinated assault against the weakest points in the United Nations defensive perimeter. If successful, this attack would shatter the Allied line and send surviving UN forces fleeing toward the port of Pusan in complete disorder. "All stations, this is Ridge Runner 6, Morrison spoke into his radio handset, using the call sign that had become familiar to every soldier in his sector. "Enemy attack commencing now. Execute Plan Delta immediately." Plan Delta represented the final defensive scheme that had been prepared for exactly this situation, a coordinated withdrawal to secondary positions while maintaining unit cohesion and maximizing enemy casualties through planned defensive fires. Sergeant Major Patrick Kelly of the 27th Infantry Regiment had served in the Pacific Theater during World War II, but the intensity of combat in Korea exceeded anything he had previously experienced. As the senior, non-commissioned officer in his battalion, Kelly moved constantly through the defensive positions, checking on his soldiers and ensuring that ammunition and medical supplies reached the units that needed them most desperately. "Keep your heads down and make every shot count," Kelly shouted to a squad of young replacements who had arrived from the United States just days earlier. These soldiers had received basic training at posts like Fort Benning and Fort Ord, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of combat against an enemy who showed no quarter and expected none in return. The first wave of North Korean infantry emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts, their movements coordinated despite the devastating artillery fire that American batteries were pouring onto their assembly areas. Communist political officers drove their men forward with a combination of ideological fervor and physical intimidation, shooting soldiers who showed signs of hesitation or attempted to seek cover during the assault. Private First Class Anthony Marcelli crouched in his foxhole as enemy mortar shells exploded around his position, sending fragments of steel humming through the air like angry hornets. The 20-year-old soldier from Philadelphia had been drafted just 6 months earlier, never imagining that he would find himself fighting for his life on a peninsula he had never heard of before receiving his orders for Korea. "Here they come again!" screamed Corporal Washington as North Korean soldiers appeared at the edge of the American defensive perimeter. The enemy infantry moved in small groups, using tactical formations that demonstrated their increasing sophistication and combat experience. These were no longer the poorly trained peasant soldiers who had initially invaded South Korea, but rather battle-hardened veterans who had learned to respect American firepower while developing tactics to overcome it. The American response reflected months of hard-won combat experience and the desperate determination of men who knew that retreat was no longer possible. Machine gun crews waited until enemy soldiers closed to point-blank range before opening fire, maximizing the effect of their limited ammunition while conserving precious supplies for the waves of attackers that would inevitably follow. Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Army Nurse Corps worked frantically in the battalion aid station as wounded soldiers streamed in from the fighting positions. The young nurse had volunteered for military service after graduating from nursing school in San Francisco, motivated by a desire to serve her country and help wounded soldiers. However, nothing in her training had prepared her for the horrific wounds caused by modern weapons or the emotional trauma of watching young men die despite her best medical efforts. "We need more plasma and bandages," Chen called to her medical technicians as they struggled to treat the ever-increasing flow of casualties. Medical supplies had become critically short throughout the Pusan perimeter, forcing medical personnel to make agonizing decisions about which wounded soldiers could be saved and which were beyond help. The North Korean breakthrough came at exactly 11:30 hours local time, when enemy armor succeeded in crossing the Naktong River at a ford that American defenders had thought impassable for tanks. The T-34 tanks emerged from the water like mechanical monsters, their machine guns chattering as they engaged American positions at point-blank range. Major William Bradford of the Tank Destroyer Battalion received the call for anti-tank support just as his unit was preparing to displace to alternate positions. The 3-inch towed anti-tank guns of his battalion represented the heaviest anti-armor weapons available to the infantry units defending the perimeter, but their effectiveness required them to remain in exposed positions until the last possible moment. "Gun crews, prepare for direct fire engagement," Bradford commanded, as his soldiers swung their weapons to engage the approaching enemy armor. The anti-tank guns fired in rapid succession, their high-velocity rounds seeking the vulnerable points in the T-34's armor protection. Several enemy tanks erupted in flames as American gunners found their marks, but others continued advancing despite taking hits that would have disabled lighter vehicles. The hand-to-hand combat that followed reached levels of savagery that shocked even veterans of the Pacific War. American soldiers armed with rifles, bayonets, and entrenching tools fought North Korean infantry in the confined spaces of bunkers and fighting positions, while enemy soldiers responded with equal determination and brutality. Quarter was neither asked nor given, as both sides recognized that the outcome of this engagement would determine the fate of the entire Korean peninsula. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the battlefield, reports reached Lieutenant General Walker's headquarters that suggested the impossible was about to happen. After more than a month of holding the Pusan perimeter against overwhelming odds, the defensive line was beginning to crack under the enormous pressure of the North Korean final offensive. Several key positions had been overrun, and enemy forces were advancing toward the vital supply lines that connected the frontline units to the port facilities at Pusan. The psychological impact of the Incheon landing rippled through the ranks like wildfire, transforming exhausted soldiers into energized warriors who suddenly saw victory as achievable rather than merely survival as possible. Sergeant Major Kelly observed the dramatic change in his men's demeanor as word spread through the defensive positions. Shoulders straightened, weapons were cleaned with renewed purpose, and conversations shifted from grim acceptance of fate to eager discussions of counterattack plans. "Boys, this changes everything," Captain Hayes addressed his company during a brief lull in the fighting. "The North Koreans are about to find out what happens when you pick a fight with the United States of America and forget to watch your back door." The captain's words drew weary grins from soldiers who had begun to doubt whether they would ever see home again. The strategic implications of MacArthur's masterstroke became apparent within hours as North Korean units along the Pusan perimeter began receiving frantic orders to redeploy northward to meet the new threat at Incheon. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing panic among enemy commanders who suddenly faced the prospect of having their supply lines severed and their entire army trapped in South Korea with no route of retreat. Colonel Morrison coordinated with his regimental counterparts as 8th Army Headquarters issued preliminary orders for the breakout operation that would transform the defenders of the Pusan perimeter from a besieged garrison into an advancing army. The tactical plans that had been developed during weeks of defensive fighting were now reversed, with American forces preparing to assault the same positions from which they had been defending just days earlier. The North Korean response to the Incheon landing demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of communist military doctrine. While their tactical commanders showed remarkable flexibility in attempting to redeploy forces northward, the centralized command structure that characterized their army proved incapable of rapid strategic adjustment. Orders from Pyongyang often contradicted local tactical requirements, creating confusion and hesitation at precisely the moment when decisive action was most needed. Private Marcelli found himself selected for one of the reconnaissance patrols that would probe enemy positions in preparation for the general offensive. The young soldier who had cowered in his foxhole just days earlier now volunteered for dangerous missions, his confidence restored by the knowledge that American forces were advancing from multiple directions. The transformation from desperate defender to aggressive attacker represented a profound psychological shift that affected every soldier in the perimeter. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez received orders to prepare his Marines for an amphibious assault across the Naktong River using landing craft that had been secretly moved into position during the previous nights. The Marines would spearhead the breakout operation, drawing upon their specialized training and combat experience to establish bridgeheads that follow-on forces could exploit. "Semper Fi, Marines!" Rodriguez shouted to his men as they blackened their faces and checked their equipment for the night river crossing. "We've been holding this line for over a month, and now it's time to show these communist bastards what happens when you corner the United States Marine Corps." The Marines responded with the traditional "Ura" that had echoed across battlefields from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. The night of September 15th marked the beginning of the end for North Korean hopes of conquering South Korea. As Marine assault boats pushed off from the southern bank of the Nakhtong River, American artillery began the heaviest bombardment of the entire campaign, systematically destroying enemy positions that had withstood weeks of previous attacks. The roles had completely reversed. Now it was the North Koreans who huddled in their bunkers, while American forces advanced with overwhelming firepower support. Lieutenant Park led one of the first assault teams across the river, his fluency in Korean proving invaluable as American forces encountered enemy soldiers who were attempting to surrender rather than fight to the death. The psychological impact of the Incheon landing had shattered North Korean morale just as effectively as American artillery was destroying their defensive positions. By dawn on September 16th, American forces had established multiple bridgeheads across the Nakhtong River and were advancing rapidly against disorganized enemy resistance. Tank columns that had been held in reserve throughout the defensive phase of the battle now rumbled forward, their tracks churning up clouds of dust as they pursued retreating North Korean units. The breakout from the Pusan perimeter became a textbook example of how defensive operations could be transformed into offensive success through strategic coordination and tactical flexibility. General Walker's 8th Army, which had seemed on the verge of destruction just days earlier, now found itself pursuing a demoralized enemy whose cohesion was rapidly disintegrating under the combined pressure of attacks from multiple directions. The human cost of the 36-day battle for the Pusan perimeter became evident as medical personnel tallied casualties and began the process of caring for wounded soldiers who had fought beyond the normal limits of human endurance. According to records maintained by the Army Medical Corps, United Nations forces had suffered approximately 22,000 casualties during the defense of the perimeter, while North Korean losses were estimated at over 60,000 killed, wounded, and missing. As American forces advanced beyond the Nakhtong River for the first time since their desperate retreat in late July, soldiers paused to reflect on the magnitude of what they had accomplished. A hastily assembled force of American, South Korean, British, and other Allied units had held the line against overwhelming odds, buying the precious time necessary for MacArthur to plan and execute the Incheon landing that would turn the tide of the entire Korean War. Corporal Washington looked back across the river that had defined his world for more than a month, his mind struggling to comprehend that the nightmare was finally ending. The foxhole that had been his home during the siege already seemed like a relic from another lifetime, though the memories of friends who had died defending the perimeter would remain with him forever. The Battle of Pusan Perimeter had ended in victory, but at a cost that would be remembered long after the strategic implications had been analyzed by military historians. Young Americans who had never heard of Korea before 1950 had written their names in blood across a foreign landscape, proving that freedom's price remained constant across generations and continents. Their sacrifice had not only saved South Korea from communist conquest, but had also demonstrated to the world that American resolve could not be broken by superior numbers or fanatical determination. The perimeter had held, time had been bought, and the tide of war had turned. In the annals of military history, few defensive actions would rival the desperate courage and ultimate triumph of the soldiers who held the line along the Nakhtong River during that sweltering summer of 1950. This crisis rippled throughout the United Nations command structure as officers at every level grappled with the possibility that their forces might face complete defeat and potential annihilation. However, unknown to the desperate defenders fighting along the Nakhtong River, events were already in motion that would fundamentally change the strategic situation and offer new hope for ultimate victory in the Korean conflict. September 15, 1950, brought news that electrified the weary defenders of the Pusan perimeter and sent shockwaves through the North Korean command structure. At dawn, General Douglas MacArthur's X-Corps had successfully landed at Incheon, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, in an amphibious operation that would be remembered as one of the most brilliant strategic strokes in military history. The landing caught North Korean forces completely by surprise and threatened to cut off their entire army in South Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell received the coded message at his command post just as his battalion was preparing for what many expected would be their final defensive action. The words seemed almost too good to be true after weeks of desperate fighting against overwhelming odds. Chromite successful. Enemy rear areas under attack. Prepare for offensive operations.